Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of DappCon, and this is our governance track. And this morning we have Stefen Deleveaux from Govern with a talk entitled The Potential for Contribution-Based Governance.
GM, good morning, everyone. It's early. So, talking about the potential for contribution-based governance and ideas around governance, and basically how contribution management can actually get us to this point. So I'm Stefen Deleveaux, head of growth at Govern. Govern is basically a platform that allows DAO contributors to easily record and actually own their own contributions, and we'll get into that in a bit. So first of all, I want to bring up this question of how do we generally think about DAOs? It's going back to basics, going back to first principles. What are the mental models that we use when we're talking about DAOs, when we're discussing DAOs, when we're telling other people about DAOs? And that question goes into, it kind of drives how we think about how these mental models dictate and drive the conversations around DAO governance and how we think about DAO governance. For example, if we consider DAOs to be companies or similar to companies, we're going to even unconsciously think about DAO governance similar to how we think about company governance or corporate governance. If we think about DAOs closer to networks, we're going to ask questions and think about how networks emerge, how they evolve, and how they're kind of governed in a sense. If we think about DAOs as co-ops, any kind of cooperative, we're going to think more about what that means, what cooperative governance looks like, how it's evolved, this idea of like one person, one vote, things around that. And and these kind of mental models, these conversations are really important to how we view the entire DAO space in general. So I do want to give a quick callback to last year, to Kia's Prehistory of DAOs article, which was extremely validating for the idea of the mental model of DAOs as co-ops, as well as DAOs as networks and guilds and the ecosystem in general. But it was extremely validating for me as someone who studied worker cooperatives in the past, and when I came into the DAO space, I already had this mental model of DAOs as co-ops, or at least very similar to co-ops. So I want to talk a bit about the current conversations around DAOs these days, where there is a heavy focus on these ideas around token governance. Obviously, Vitalik has written about the suboptimal nature of token-weighted governance, which is how most DAOs operate today, and the fact that they lead to plutocracy and all kinds of other issues. And of course, after the DSOC paper, there's a lot of conversation and focus on soul-bound tokens and what that means for governance and whether we should all kind of migrate to using that. And these are extremely important conversations, but I think we do need to start stepping back and focus a bit less on the style of tokens that we're using or the type of tokens that we're using, and just focus on a bit more on the experimentations around governance styles themselves. What kind of style do we want for governance? How do we think about governance? What do we really want to create at the end of the day? What are we building towards? Unfortunately, we can't play GIFs, but I think most of you are devs here. So I'm sure many of you remember the Steve Ballmer talk at Microsoft, the developers, and it's one of my favorite talks because it's hilarious, but at the same time, it was actually a really great call to action to say that if we want what we're doing to flourish, if we want it to be sustainable in the long run, we have to focus on the developers. We have to focus on empowering them, including them, and making sure they're involved so they can just build what they need to build on our systems at the end of the day. And I think this is what the DAO space needs to be doing for contributors, where, especially given the question of how should we involve all these different stakeholders, because of course there are multiple, but when it comes to governance, who should we be involving the most in governance? And also, who should be benefiting the most from this governance? And of course, that should be contributors, because they are the building blocks of DAOs, and the focus of what we're doing should be focused on contributors. And you may ask why. Why are contributors so important compared to other stakeholders, other funders, et cetera? This quote from Lincoln is one I've always liked. And it's basically, labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and can never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. And that's something I think is true, and even in this space where we can kind of create tokens out of thin air, create capital out of thin air, it still goes back to labor at the end of the day, and labor has to actually drive this and push this. And if you can have a DAO with a treasury of $1 billion, but if you have no contributors to actually use that and drive that, then your DAO isn't going to be very impactful at the end of the day. So, if we want to create this idea of DAOs and DAO governance that's focused on the contributors, DAOs that create impact based around contributors and contributions, what are the obstacles to actually create this? What do we have to do to create this idea of more contribution-based governance, and maybe even the elusive one person, one vote that we see in co-ops? First thing, civil resistance is hard. We can't ever get to this ideal of one person, one vote, if we don't even know who one person is. We don't know what's going on or whether someone is actually represented by 10 wallets, et cetera. And obviously, this is a very hard problem to solve. There are multiple projects working on this, but of course, there's still issues and questions around usability, scalability, and things of that nature. And it's going to take a long time to get to that point where we can even really say we've created civil resistance. And it's just really hard to track what work's being done. Most DAOs, people have no idea what's going on. Contributors don't really know or understand what other contributors are doing. Even, let's say, DAO core teams, for example, they may not know what contributors are doing until a bit further down the line when things are starting to blossom out of the work that's being done. And of course, there are a lot of tools DAOs are using now to try to correct this problem. A lot of DAOs are using bounty boards, which are okay in certain contexts, but they're inefficient in some ways, and you can't really run an entire organization based just off bounty boards. And also, you'd be surprised to see a lot of DAOs are just core teams using Excel spreadsheets to actually track the contributions that are happening. And to be honest, this is not the future of work. It doesn't represent the future of work. And if our DAOs just turn out to be Excel spreadsheets, then we might as well pack up now, because we're not going to create the future out of that. And the third thing is there's no real taxonomy for contributions. Now, if you have two contributors, for example, imagine you have two contributors in a DAO working on the same project. They finish the project, they report it back, they start talking about it. The ways that both contributors actually talk about the project and talk about what's happening could be completely different. They could use completely different words, they could use completely different explanations, and that just creates chaos at the end of the day. Because now the question comes in terms of reward and compensation and what we do next. And we don't really understand, maybe just as other contributors or the core team or whoever, what's actually happening, because we're using completely different lingo, completely different language, and completely different ways to talk about it. So of course, these are a lot of problems. What is the solution for that? We think contribution management paves the way for contribution-based governance. We think contribution management actually solves these problems. And contribution management is what Govern does mainly, and I'll show you a little bit of what it potentially looks like. So of course, this is just one of the main pages of Govern. You go on, you record your contributions, quite simple. You have the name of the contribution. We just kind of explain what it is. You can't see it here, but you can there's also a detail section where you can kind of go into it a bit more, explain exactly what's going on in further detail. Also so that other people other contributors, core team or whoever, can actually can understand a bit more and kind of build more ideas around what's happening. You also have activity type or contribution type where, and this is interesting because this can actually be preset by a DAO, for example, where whatever contributions are typically happening in general in a DAO, or what the DAO considers to be what their needs are the most, or what's most valuable to them, they can preset, and you can have this kind of list of things that you can choose from based on what contributions you're doing. And at the same time, a single DAO contributor can add their own contribution type, and when they push it up, this can actually create or open the door to create conversation around, okay, well, what's this you're working on? Is this necessary for us? Is this valuable for us? Maybe we hadn't thought about this before, and you start to build this convergence between, let's say, the core team, for example, and the individual contributor. And over time, this builds a flywheel where the DAO itself is expanding and understanding more about what's happening within the DAO and what's important and what's most valuable for the DAO. And that goes back to the whole taxonomy question, as well as, if the contribution was written or the work done was written, for example, a project, for example, you can post a URL, you can post a proof, and you can also add the date. And then when you add the contribution, and also you can assign it or attribute it to a specific DAO. You can also attribute it to multiple DAOs, which I think is really important for the future. And the fact that so many people are contributing to multiple DAOs, or let's say you're building this you're working on this DAO-to-DAO collaboration. The work you're doing isn't just useful for one DAO, it's useful for two. And at the same time, we also want to push this idea and the fact that your own contributions may be useful for one DAO, but in a sense, it's also useful for many. And what you're doing in terms of work isn't just useful for one DAO, it is useful and expands the entire ecosystem. This is just what a record of your contributions can look like. You can be dated. You can actually have separated between, you just have it for your own record, and you can also mint it on chain. And we do that with Gnosis Chain so that you always have this record and you always own this record at the end of the day. And the idea is basically that if you own this record, no matter where you go, no matter what DAOs you contribute to or join, you can always have this record with you. This is also contribution types, which again goes back to the taxonomy question, where you can see, and also the DAO can see, what kind of contributions happen the most in your DAO. If demos are happening, you can kind of experiment and figure out where should we go next with this, what should we add, what kind of other contributions can we do, what's really necessary and what's really needed for our DAOs. And this is an important point, the attestation. So if I'm recording my contributions and I put it up to the DAO, there's always the question of, was this actually done? And did you report this or record this correctly? So instead of a core team or core contributor having to go down and double check and make sure things happen, you can have, let's say you did a project with a number of other contributors. Those other contributors can go and attest and talk and record that, yes, we're validating that this actually happened. And that kind of eases pressure off the core team themselves, and it also creates more bonds between the contributors. And it just really adds another layer of verification and validation at the end of the day. So now we have this idea of contributor ownership, and we also have this idea of validation and verification. So that's just a quick run through. But what happens when DAOs use contribution management? Going back to the problems we expressed earlier, Sybil resistance is hard. And obviously, we are not solving for Sybil resistance. But with this kind of system, with this kind of management tool, you can reduce the need for it, because now we're focusing a lot more on what's happening in real time. We're converging and verifying and validating. Now, it's hard to track what work is being done. Solved. We're tracking the work. And the fact that there's no taxonomy for contributions, well, we're actually creating this taxonomy in real time. And of course, that's a long-term process, but it flows and it evolves and it expands as an entire DAO. So let's imagine you're using this in your DAO, which is great. But now think about what happens when multiple DAOs are using this, or even the entire DAO ecosystem is using this. Now it's not just contributors within a DAO and one siloed DAO working, and another DAO is using it and working in a silo. What we're doing now is we're creating an entire contribution graph where we can actually see, and the entire space can have an overview of what work is actually being done within a DAO, and what work is actually being done in the entire DAO ecosystem. And with that, we can find, areas of potential collaboration. I'll give a quick example. We work very extensively with Boys Club. Shout out to them, amazing team. But what happens when we're not just working with Boys Club, we're working with SheFi, we're working with Surge, we're working with Blue DAO, and now we have all these DAOs that are focused on women, bringing women into the space, onboarding women into the space. They can now find points of collaboration, they can find points of overlap, they can basically use the contributions, the work that's being done on the ground to form together, to work together more, find more points to collaborate, and then that drives impact, and that increases impact, and that expands impact in a way that just wasn't truly possible before. And all this is not top down, this is bottom up. This is all individual points of work, and we're all expanding the DAO ecosystem through our individual work, through our individual layer. And a little chaotic, but and this contribution graph ends up serving as an entire contribution layer that basically undergirds the entire space. Now, for example, there are a lot of great projects, excellent projects working on value frameworks, reputation, points for compensation, and all these are extremely necessary if we really want DAOs to be the future of work, and if we really want contributors to be able to be properly compensated, be properly rewarded, work in ways where they maybe get access to certain things as necessary. But at the end of the day, all of this needs to be undergirded by this contribution layer, because that is the main point of interaction. That is the work that's being done at the end of the day. And all this is possible because with the beauty of composability, we can interact and integrate with all these different platforms and make sure that the reputation and the compensation and everything that's happening is directly connected to this contribution layer and is directly connected to all the work that's being done and recorded by contributors. So then we can actually build this thriving and healthy DAO ecosystem based off of our labor rather than just our capital. And at the end of the day, this basically creates the potential for contribution-based governance and potentially even this co-op ideal of one person, one vote. So join us as we build the contribution layer for DAOs. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefen. Thank you, Stefen, for your contribution today. And we have a few minutes for Q&A.
Hey everyone. So this was a really good presentation, and I appreciate the different model and the contribution layer. Just in the interest of time, I just wanted to ask specifically, how do you solve for collusion detection inside of your Govern?
Yeah, that's something we think a lot about. The potential for collusion, the potential for bribes, which happen in any kind of system. And a lot of that does come back down to the attestation, on the attestation layer, and this also interacts with reputation systems, for example, where someone with a higher level of reputation within a DAO, if they attest to the work that you're done, it seemed to be more trusted. Now, of course, that can still breed some kind of collusion. And that's really up to the DAO at the end of the day, which we don't want to make decisions for the DAOs. We want the DAOs to make decisions for themselves. An example we like to think about a lot is, let's say you record a contribution, and then you build 1,000 bots to go and attest to the work that you've done. Now it's a little chaotic, right? But at the end of the day, the DAO itself can base this question on, okay, who is actually attesting to the work that's done? How many people in a certain maybe guild or a pod or a squad, however you interact with it, who are these people? Are these people that directly work with the contributor? Are these people from another squad, for example? Is it someone from core team? And obviously, this isn't perfect in terms of there will always be the potential for collusion. We don't completely eliminate that, but with this attestation layer, it makes that harder. And then, given interactions with the reputation system, we can actually build penalties for collusion once they're found out.
I think it's in the same direction. I saw that you have addresses there on the screen, and that you have like kind of real names. So what are you tracking? Are people going into the account by using their real name or whatever handle, or are they using their addresses to contribute?
That's a good question. So those were mainly examples, like demo examples, but you mainly interact via your wallet. So really, if you choose your name, that's up to you.
Yes. Don't take that personally. Just a question about the process.
Please.
Wouldn't it be faster to just like try to figure out, because the whole contribution relation doesn't need to be completely on-chain. The whole process I can see is basically off-chain. I mean, you could just like plug MetaMask into, like, let's call it Jira, for example, and basically get the thing done faster. I'm using the same principle of like a settlement layer and a computational, which is like off-chain. I mean, what would be the feasibility of such a tool in lieu of building something which is completely new? Because it would be easier to get like the whole dev world to just like, log in with MetaMask onto Jira and Confluence and just, start pushing things. The organizational structure is already here. The processes are already done.
Can you repeat the last part? Just
I mean, the processes and the organizational structures, like using like Atlassian, is already set up. I mean, just using a plugin, for example, a MetaMask plugin,
right.
You could just get this whole contribution layer like really sped up, because at the end of the day, the DAO doesn't need a whole on-chain tool. It just needs the confirmation, the settlement to be on-chain, and you could just use the whole existing mechanism that is already being used inside the broader industry, and just use that, and then settle all the data and all the proof and everything on-chain.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't really have a great answer for that, but at the end of the day, there's multiple ways that we're looking at it, where one, a lot of this is really about building this kind of emergent bottom-up style of governance in terms of how the contributors interact with the DAOs themselves. And at the end of the day, I mean, you mentioned on-chain, that's really, and we're talking to people about verifiable credentials, for example. So it doesn't have to be on-chain if it doesn't want, but it's really up to you as an individual.
I think that's it for our time. Thank you so much, Stefen.